when I was at the eye of this sort of cancellation storm, I desperately wanted there to be an organization I could reach out to that would give me good professional advice. Should I get out there and defend myself, or less said, sooner mended? If I apologize, will that make things better or worse? Is there anyone you can put me in touch with who's gone through something similar? Do I need to revert to law to try and threaten people with defamation suits for saying false things about me? But there was no organization like that. So I just had to basically stand there and watch my career burning to the ground. So when I'd recovered, I then set up the organization that I desperately wanted to be there when I was cancelled.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of Domestic Policy here at MLI. Why is free speech, once considered a bedrock value, now so contested in our most powerful institutions? Over the past decade, debates about what can and can't be said have intensified across universities, schools, newsrooms, and corporate boardrooms. In Canada and beyond, speech codes, cancel campaigns, and ideological conformity have become flashpoints in a deeper cultural and political struggle. As someone involved in policy conversations on this side of the Atlantic, I've watched closely as the UK has moved from a beacon of free expression to one of the most censorious countries in the Western world, where they now arrest people for non-crime hate incidents, like praying in public. The tide seemed to be turning with a new free speech law 2 years ago, but it's only been partially implemented. And it's a similar story in Canada. Some of the more egregious attempts to restrict expression in the online harms bill are halted for now, but other broad user content restrictions were passed through the Online Streaming Act. And what's more, just recently, Sean Feucht, a religious artist with political messaging, has had multiple events canceled by officials across Canadian cities and fines levied against churches for hosting him. These are significant developments on both sides of the pond that raise practical and philosophical questions for Canada, the UK, and other Western countries' path forward. And joining us today to unpack this is Toby Young, founder and director of the Free Speech Union, a well-known journalist, commentator, and author. Toby has been at the forefront of the UK's free speech movement, defending individuals facing ideological persecution, advocating for legislative reform, and helping shape the public debate. His work offers a compelling window into what a robust defense of expressive freedom looks like. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to please like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these ideas. Toby, thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Let's dive right in, Toby, with the founding of the Free Speech Union. Was there a particular moment when you realized that cultural criticism wasn't enough and that legal and institutional infrastructure was needed to defend free expression?
Well, I guess the pivotal event for me was being cancelled myself in 2018. I was appointed by the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, to be a non-executive director of a new higher education regulator in England called the Office for Students. And as soon as my appointment was announced, my political enemies started doing offense archaeology on me, digging down into everything I'd said or written dating back to 1987, looking for content to be outraged by, performatively outraged by. And because I'd been a fairly contentious, outspoken journalist for most of my career, it didn't take them long to find a Tutankhamun's tomb's worth of material to be offended by. And after all this had been dug up, I resigned and apologized for some of the more inflammatory things I'd said in the past, and thought that would draw a line under it. But that turned out to be like throwing a hunk of raw meat to a shoal of piranha fish. And they then came for me in 4 other positions, and I ended up having to step down from 5 positions. And when that was happening to me, when I was at the eye of this sort of cancellation storm, I desperately wanted there to be an organization I could reach out to that would give me good professional advice. Should I get out there and defend myself, or less said, sooner mended? If I apologize, will that make things better or worse? Is there anyone you can put me in touch with who's gone through something similar? Do I need to revert to law to try and threaten people with defamation suits for saying false things about me? But there was no organization like that. So I just had to basically stand there and watch my career burning to the ground. So when I'd recovered, I then set up the organization that I desperately wanted to be there when I was cancelled. And it didn't look at the time as though cancel culture was going anywhere. And when I set it up in February 2020, I thought that free speech hadn't been in greater peril in the United Kingdom than at any time since the Second World War. Things had reached absolute rock bottom. And I didn't imagine then, rather naively, that things could get any worse. And then about a month later, the pandemic happened and Britain locked everyone in their homes. And suddenly a whole new swathe of people were being cancelled for challenging the government's pandemic response. And later, when the government started issuing vaccine mandates, people got cancelled, particularly in the medical professions, for challenging vaccine mandates. So, and then there was the whole imbroglio over the death of George Floyd. And suddenly, if you challenge the idea that Britain was systematically racist or institutionally racist, you'd be at risk of cancellation. So everything's got a lot worse, in fact, in the last 5 years, and we've had no shortage of people joining. So the Free Speech Union is a membership organization. If you join, we will go to bat for you if you get into trouble for exercising your right to lawful free speech. We've now got 31,000 members. We've fought over 4,000 cases in the last 5 years. We've been successful about 80% of the time, and it's now growing internationally. So we have sister organizations now in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and I'm happy to say in Canada. One has just opened in Canada, and the reason I'm in Vancouver right now is I spoke at a fundraiser for the Canadian Free Speech Union last night.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's great to hear that the organization is having such success on the legal front, because indeed the law in Canada and in places like the UK can very much be an impediment. But I want to say, just in hearing the brief history there, because I want to say that we've reached, in some senses, the peak of this ideological fervor, colloquially known as.
Be careful, Peter.
Right. Okay. I wouldn't want to.
At each of the Free Speech Union's anniversary parties, I've got up and said,
"Don't be
things are terrible now, but we've reached peak woke. The pendulum is beginning to swing back the other way, only for things to get worse by the following years." So we should be careful about being too optimistic.
I will carefully qualify that statement then. Nevertheless, these things have a long after effect, and maybe that's how I would put it. It seems as though, because on the one hand, there are many more people willing to openly and publicly criticize, let's call them mainstream or taboo ideas. On the other hand, it seems as though there are policy responses and other sorts of things, legal cases, firings, what have you, that are still occurring. Perhaps they're shifting to more everyday people, not the kind of intellectuals who do combat in the ideological sphere. Do you have any comment about your perception on the trend?
Well, we've certainly seen no fall in the number of people reaching out to the Free Speech Union for help in the UK. On average, 37 new people contact us requesting help. And since the Labour Party won the general election last year, things have got significantly worse. So one example is the Times of London recently, through Freedom of Information request, discovered that the police are arresting people and investigating them for committing just 2 speech offences, more than 12,000 a year. So 12,000 a year being arrested just under suspicion of having broken two speech laws, and that's an average of about 30 a day, and that's a significant uptick on previous years. We recently saw the prosecution of a Turkish political refugee called Hamit Koskan for burning a copy of the Quran outside the Turkish consulate in London. That was a new departure and seemed to be criminalizing something that is a breach of a Muslim blasphemy code. Our government is currently in the process of devising an official state-approved definition of Islamophobia. It's not going to be a statutory definition, so it's not going to be embedded in law, but it will be rolled out across public bodies and embedded in speech codes, and people will be at risk of losing their livelihoods if they are, quote unquote, Islamophobic under this new definition. I mean, there are all sorts of new laws heading towards us in the UK, which are going to further fetter our free speech. I mean, I naively thought when I created the Free Speech Union that we'd be able to roll back some of the restrictions on our free speech. But in fact, things have just got significantly worse over the last 5 years. A good example, probably the most recent example, is the implementation of the Online Safety Act, which isn't a million miles away from your online harms bill. The Free Speech Union did manage to lobby the previous government when that particular piece of legislation was going through Parliament. And originally, Ofcom, our broadcast regulator, which is now also the regulator of social media, search engines, user-to-user service providers on the internet, originally it was going to be empowered to fine service providers up to 10% of their annual global turnover if they failed to remove content that was legal, so not against the law, legal but harmful. And content that was legal but harmful was going to be designated by a senior member of the government. It was going to draw up a list. He or she was going to draw up a list of content that was perfectly legal in the UK, but which social media companies would have to remove on pain of being fined 10% of their annual global turnover. We succeeded in getting that clause removed from the bill, so it's not in the Act, but social media companies, service providers are still under an obligation to remove legal but harmful content which is accessible by children. So they've started to age gate content that is perfectly legal but is supposedly harmful to children. And we've seen, as a consequence, that came into force very recently. And as a consequence, vast swathes of seemingly innocuous content has been removed by X, Instagram, Facebook, including a blog about Richard the Lionheart, footage of a Conservative member of Parliament talking about the grooming gangs, footage of someone being arrested in Leeds, a northern city, at an anti-immigration protest. So our fears about just how misused the Online Safety Act would be have materialized. In fact, it's worse than we predicted. It has led to over-removal under the guise of protecting children from legal but harmful content.
Mm-hmm. Very good. This is exactly where I wanted to go, the legislative frameworks in Canada and the UK. Let's stick on the UK for a bit, and I'll ask you just to elaborate a bit further on what's novel, both in the law and perhaps its interpretation and enforcement in recent years. One of the common themes across multiple pieces of legislation seems to be vague terminology. There's a new standard. I understand the gross offense standards. There are now these non-crime hate incidents that are recorded despite no actual law being broken. Help us understand what is kind of at the core and what is common to the new pieces of legislation or new approaches to enforcement that's going on here, and what's problematic about it.
Well, to start with non-crime hate incidents, So that's a concept that the College of Policing, a police training and education body, came up with in 2014. And the way it works is that if the police receive a report of a hate crime, they invariably investigate. They don't want to be accused of neglecting hate crime. So they investigate. And if they conclude that no actual crime has been committed, instead of just dismissing the case, they record it as a non-crime hate incident. And the College of Policing advised them to do this in every case. So every time someone's reported of committing a hate crime, they end up, even if they haven't committed a crime, on a police database as having committed a non-crime hate incident. And if you go on to apply for a job, say as a teacher or a carer, which requires you to do an enhanced criminal records check, the police can disclose to your prospective employer that you are on this database as having committed a non-crime hate incident. So it does have real-world consequences. And through various FOI requests, the Free Speech Union has determined that since 2014, over 250,000 non-crime hate incidents have been recorded in England and Wales alone, which is an average of about 62 a day. So what's problematic about that? Well, it's problematic, I think, that someone can be penalized by the police for a non-crime. I mean, one of the linchpins of English liberty was the common law principle that unless something is explicitly prohibited by law, then it's permitted. But this breaches that principle and creates a grey area where you can do something which isn't against the law and still get into trouble with the police. And that's also reflected, I think, in the policing of social media under the Online Safety Act by Ofcom. They're effectively telling social media companies to remove lawful content. So some content, even though lawful, is effectively being prohibited, being censored. And that, again, is in this same grey area. And I think that kind of creep, that departure from that really important foundation of English liberty is deeply alarming. What's behind it? In part, it's one of the features, anyway, of this kind of creeping suppression of lawful speech is an ever-expanding definition of harm. So to include psychological harm. And how do you judge whether someone has been psychologically harmed by something they've seen on social media or by something someone said to them in a pub? Well, it's all perception-based. We're under an obligation to believe victims. So if someone claims that they perceived something that was said to them as being based on hostility to them because of their membership of a particular protected group, a particular victim group, that perception is enough for it to be judged harmful and prohibited in some way, whether by being criminalized or just being suppressed in a non-statutory way. I think that seems to be at the heart of it, a kind of obsession with safety, with psychological safety, keeping people safe. But of course, it's not everyone. If a heterosexual white man claims that someone said something to them and they think that it's based on hostility to them being heterosexual or white or male, they're very unlikely to be taken seriously. So it's psychological harm befalling members of particular sacralized victim groups that seems to be what the authorities are increasingly concerned about policing. And this has led to accusations of two-tier policing, two-tier criminal justice system in the UK. So, people who protested about the draconian lockdown measures imposed during the pandemic were effectively charged by riot police and rounded up, kettled, in some cases locked up, charged with criminal offences but hundreds of thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters chanting "from the river to the sea" are allowed to walk unmolested through our major city centres virtually every weekend. So it's this incredibly expansive, capacious definition of psychological harm, but only as applied to members of certain victim groups, not everybody.
Very well stated, and very similar to Canada, I should say. I'm going to return to this question of how did we get there, to this question of psychological harm and its importance. But before we do, I want to get your thoughts on the Canadian legislative context insofar as you're familiar with it. We have the Online Streaming Act here, empowers unelected regulators to control discoverability of user generated content through our regulator, the CRTC, Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission. And the proposed, not yet enforced, thankfully, Online Harms Act, it would rely on a section of the Canadian Human Rights Act, Section 13, allowing complaints for speech that is likely to expose to hate or contempt, which creates a preemptive speech restriction through something like a peace bond on people suspected of hate propaganda. So it sounds very similar to the recording and almost assigning of social credit via the non-crime hate incident that you mentioned. And of course, steep penalties for lawful but controversial speech. So, what do you make of these Canadian proposals, and do you see a shared trend across other Anglosphere or Western liberal democracies? You're operating in many countries now.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the online harms, is it referred to as the Online Harms Bill or the Online Harms Act in
Either or,
Canada?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it does seem to be even more sinister than our own Online Safety Act, for various reasons. But two immediately jump out. One is what you've already referred to, which is anyone who is deemed to have posted something psychologically harmful to a member of a victim group is financially liable, as I understand it, and has to pay financial compensation to the victim. And you can imagine that that process is tilted heavily in favor of the self-identified victim, and might, for instance, include trans women who've been misgendered by gender critical feminists on social media. But the other really sinister aspect of it is, as I understand it, someone can be placed effectively under house arrest and have all their digital communication devices taken from them if they're suspected of being about to post something hateful, psychologically harmful, a kind of almost like the pre-crime unit in Minority Report, and that's pretty sinister. And what's behind it? Well, I think it's partly that uh, uh, political parties, the criminal justice system, the courts, the police, seem to have been captured by radical progressive ideology. They seem to believe that the main justification for their authority, what their authority is rooted in, what legitimizes their exercise of power, is that they are the moral guardians of vulnerable, marginalized identity groups. This is what gives them their legitimacy. They can be trusted to protect the psychological well-being of these marginalized, oppressed groups, and that seems to be rooted in radical progressive ideology, which emerged in the United States, probably in grievance studies departments at Ivy League universities. Cultivated this ideology dating back probably to the 1960s. Sort of, I think what Jordan Peterson calls neo-Marxist postmodernism. Seems to have emerged been developed in these kind of labs at Ivy League universities, and then escaped and has now kind of spread across the world via the vector of social media, and one of the and captured, the entire professional managerial class across the English-speaking world. One of the reasons I think it's infected the PMC more badly in the English-speaking world is that the vector of transmission is social media, and the first language of social media is English. Although it is beginning, we're finding that it is beginning now to infect the non-English speaking world, France, Germany. In France, there is this increasingly common phrase, le wokism. And we've had people. I recently set up a body called FSU International to help other groups set up free speech unions in their countries. And we're getting a lot of contact now from people in France, from people in Germany, from people in Austria, Italy, Norway, Sweden. So it's definitely spreading now beyond the English-speaking world. But it seems to be worse in Britain and Canada than anywhere else, but pretty bad in New Zealand, South Africa, and Australia as well. I think. I mean, one of the. I think it's sort of at the heart of it seems to be a kind of almost irrational fear on the part of the liberal ruling elite. One of the reasons I think they've embraced this ideology so enthusiastically, they seem to have a visceral, irrational fear of populist revolt. In Europe, I don't know about in Canada, but certainly in Britain and across the continent, there's this kind of fear of ethno-nationalism, which dates back to the Second World War and the founding of the European Union, all designed to contain outbreaks of ethno-nationalism, so we don't have a repeat of the First or the Second World War, and in particular, we don't see parties like the Nazi Party coming to power again. So there is this kind of irrational fear of populism, of right-wing insurgent political parties, and mistakenly, I think, the kind of sclerotic liberal elites who kind of think that the end of their hegemony is near, believe that the best way to cling on to power, to prevent the electoral success of parties like Reform UK or in Germany AFD, is to suppress what they kind of call misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. That's the way to prevent these populist movements from erupting and sweeping them from power. It's sort of symptomatic, I think, of an increasingly brittle, paranoid kind of ruling elite, lashing out, engaging in censorship, trying to jail their opponents, essentially abandoning democratic norms in the name of preserving democracy. The reason I say I think it's mistaken is that we know historically that that doesn't work. I mean, it was tried in the Weimar Republic. Anti-Semitism in various German states was criminalized. Various prominent Nazis were jailed. It became illegal to publish Nazi newspapers. Hitler was banned from speaking in various German states. This was all part of the apparatus to try and keep the Nazi party down. And it didn't work. It had the opposite of its intended effect. It enabled Nazi leaders to pose as, enemies of the establishment, as people they couldn't cope with, people whose truth they were suppressing, and I think the consensus amongst liberal elites, I think, until fairly recently, was that the best way. It was summed up by a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, in a landmark First Amendment case at the beginning of the 20th century, in which he said that the best way to counter misleading or harmful speech was not enforced silence, but more and better speech. That was the counter speech doctrine. And that seemed like a very sensible way of dealing with speech that you think is potentially harmful or misleading. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And that was the prevailing consensus till about 15 years ago. But it appears to have been abandoned by our various liberal elites, and I think mistakenly, and I think it's
Mm-hmm.
just going to hasten their demise.
Oh, I think that's a really astute set of observations. And it almost seems as though, I know at the core of this issue is just how like intellectually moribund the political left and even center liberal parties are right now. Like they're kind of replaying old hits. They're on the same track. They're out of steam, and so there's no recognition that there are problems here. There is just the reapplication of same sort of ideas, or failure to recognize the problem, and so it's almost like an exhausted kind of act of self-preservation.
Yeah,
So
I mean, just on
yeah,
that
please.
point, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the reasons our masters want to silence dissent rather than engage with it and take it on in the public square, um, is because they've really lost their faith
Mm,
in the kind of liberal ideology and lost faith in some of the policies associated with that particular political outlook, like mass immigration. And because they've lost faith deep down in those policies and that governing ideology, they don't want to be forced to defend it.
right.
They wouldn't really know how to go about defending it in the public square. So easier just to silence their critics and pretend that their particular position doesn't require a political defense. So the concept of misinformation is quite instructive here. The idea being that if you disagree with, say, a policy of uncontrolled mass immigration, effectively open borders, it's not because you have legitimate grounds or good political reasons for doing so. It must be because you've been misinformed. Because anyone who's been informed properly and is fully acquainted with all the facts would agree with them. So that's I think why they've latched onto this concept of misinformation so enthusiastically. It enables them to avoid having to defend what is a very politically contentious set of policies. And yeah, it's yeah, I think it is as you say. It's kind of it's a way of following the science is another example, isn't it? To pretend that the pandemic response, which was in fact very contentious, not endorsed by the science, or at least not by many, not by a number of scientists, and involved a political choice, which meant prioritizing safety over liberty. But the pretense was, no, we're not making a political choice, so we don't need to defend it politically. We're just following the science. Anyone who doesn't agree with us is just misinformed. They're conspiracy theorists, or they've been led astray by bad actors. It's all as you say. It's a means of. I think it's psychologically what's behind it is it's avoiding having to acknowledge to themselves that they have lost their faith.
Yeah, fascinating. Um, okay, let's go to the UK's Higher Education or Freedom of Speech Act, because you were heavily involved with this. We're proud to say that one of our senior fellows, who's over there as well at the University of Buckingham, Eric Kaufman, was as well. Very promising development, but as I understand it, many of its enforcement teeth, like the statutory tort to enforce, preserving free speech and open inquiry on university campuses, and this independent free speech director idea, have been stripped out or delayed. Maybe you can just tell us a bit about this act, what it hopes to accomplish, and where it's at right
Yes.
now.
Yes. So, yeah, Eric and I and a group of mainly conservative academics were involved in helping to draft the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, and then helping to pilot it through the last Parliament. And what it does, in a nutshell, is it creates more robust protections for free speech and academic freedom on English, just English university campuses. And it also, as you say, created a couple of enforcement mechanisms, one of which was the creation of the office of a free speech czar in the Office for Students, the higher education regulator in England that I was once upon a time appointed to briefly. And if you are a student or an academic or a visiting speaker and you think your speech rights have been breached by a university, you can complain to this free speech czar at the Office for Students. He can, if he thinks your complaint has merit, investigate and fine universities for failing to protect your free speech. And in addition, there was a new statutory tort whereby if you found yourself in that position, student, speaker, academic member of staff, and felt that your speech had been breached by a university, you could sue them in the Crown Court. And we felt this would make a difference. We have a free speech crisis in Britain's universities, as I'm sure you do in Canada's universities too, partly because of the rapid spread of the woke mind virus on university campuses. And we thought this would make a difference, not least because it would create these two enforcement mechanisms. There were various protections already on the statute books in the UK for free speech and academic freedom on campus, but they were more honoured in the breach than the observance because there was no real penalty for universities to ignore them. But this created some penalties. Soon as the Labour government came to power in July of last year, the new Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, one of the first acts of hers was to pause the commencement of the outstanding clauses of this act. So even though it received royal assent in 2023, most of the important clauses, including the complaint scheme, the statutory tort, even the new, more robust free speech protections, none of them had been commenced. They were due to be commenced on August 1st of last year. So Bridget Phillipson just paused their commencement. She revoked the commencement orders. We, the Free Speech Union, then legally challenged the decision by her to revoke the commencement orders. We argued that that was a breach of a fundamental principle of the British Constitution, which is that a minister of the Crown cannot defy the will of Parliament. So if Parliament wants to repeal the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, there'd be no constitutional impediment to doing that. But for her to simply, by ministerial fiat, effectively torpedo it, we thought was a breach of this important constitutional principle. And a week before that case was due to be heard in the High Court, Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, did a partial U-turn and announced she would be implementing some of it, but not all of it. So the new, more robust free speech protections come into force on the 1st of August. By the time people watch this, they'll be in force. And the complaint scheme it's not going to be put in place by the 1st of August because the government wants to revise it to make it slightly more toothless. And they're waiting for an appropriate legislative vehicle to attach an amendment to, which will bring the complaint scheme into force. And we hope that'll happen in due course. But the statutory tort, that's been just repealed. So we're not going to see the statutory tort, which is a great shame. But we regard that as a partial victory, and we're now asking the government to pay our legal costs, which, as you can imagine, are quite high. That's where we're at with that. But I think the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act is a really good model And I'm pleased to say that a version of it is going through the New Zealand Parliament at the moment.
Okay.
And I would urge Canadians to take a good look at it and see if they can do something with it in Canada.
We certainly shall. And we actually have a conference coming up here in August on these matters, university reform. And I think you're quite right to have focused there because, as you stated, it was the birthplace of many of these ideas that are now have made their way into all aspects of our society. This is a good example of external imposed change on universities. And there's this debate going on right now, mostly in the US, but really across the Anglosphere, about whether universities can reform themselves or whether external legislative action is required. And the two, recent statements that represent these differing perspectives, the university-led reform represented on the one hand by the heterodox academy, I would say. They've just come out with a statement actually in response to the Manhattan Statement, which was led by Chris Rufo and signed by over 50 academics, calling for external government imposed legislative reform. You've had a fair bit of time now dealing with these issues and studying universities and how they respond to free speech issues. What do you make of these different approaches? Can universities reform themselves, or do they need an external push? Is there a balance between these two perspectives? Would love to hear what you think.
Mm. This was a debate that took place within the group, which included Eric Kaufman. And some people were initially a bit hesitant about the state effectively intervening and forcing universities to do more to uphold free speech and academic freedom on campus. The concern was that was an interference in the autonomy of these civic institutions and state overreach. But that inhibition was passed quite quickly. I think we thought that first of all, universities have had some time to get their house in order and do more to protect free speech and academic freedom, and had just been comprehensively failing. And I think, in addition, I think we thought free speech is a fundamental human right, and it doesn't seem unreasonable for the state, which is perfectly happy to intervene to make sure institutions are upholding other human rights, for the state to intervene to make sure universities are upholding the right to freedom of expression. When universities pushed back and made this argument, this is state overreach. How dare you encroach on the autonomy of these civic institutions? We pointed out that when the Equality Act was passed in 2010, which is a sort of a fairly left-wing piece of legislation, but requires universities to jump through all kinds of hoops to protect students and academics who have protected characteristics. They were completely unhesitant about embracing the Equality Act, nary a squeak about state overreach when it came to effectively rolling out these socialist policies at the behest of the state across campus. But the moment they're asked to do something slightly more to protect free speech and academic freedom, they squeal about illegitimate interference in their autonomy. So we didn't, in the end, take that argument very seriously.
Yeah, no, I think quite right. I mean, there was so much time to deal with these issues, not much done, as you say, a human right. But even more importantly, in the university context and in other communications field like media and journalism, open inquiry is foundational to their very mission and purpose. So I think it's quite right. We just have to be mindful of the manner in which it's carried out, of course,
Yes.
because there's a lot to preserve there as well. So,
Yeah. I've had this argument too with kind of Randian libertarians
mm-hmm,
who believe that freedom of association is absolutely sacrosanct. And for that reason, the state should be extremely circumspect about even trying to insist that freedom of speech is upheld by private companies. And one response I have to that is that until quite recently, the private sector was conservative with a small c and served as a bulwark against the socialist with a capital S politics of the public sector. And the two things, held one another in check. But in the past 15 years or so, we've seen the capture of the private sector, particularly large corporations, by radical progressive ideology. So now they're pushing in the same direction politically as the public sector. So I think we if we care about upholding freedom of speech, we don't need to be as circumspect about interfering in the freedom of association of private companies, which are constantly engaging
mm-hmm,
in the suppression of free speech
right.
via the embedding of various ridiculous speech codes.
Mm, fascinating. Okay, I want to return, Toby, to the deeper genesis of these ideas. You mentioned subjectivity, psychological harm. I think is rooted in the idea of the subjective, unique, unrepeatable person and their ability to cultivate their sense of self through expression, and anything that restricts that is harmful. This is fairly novel idea. It has a long tail in German Romanticism and things like that. But it forms part of the backdrop, and there's interesting debates going on right now. The question of, is this itself an aberration or departure from some core liberal ideas, or is it um, liberalism's kind of logical endpoint, or if all of the core liberal ideas are emphasized to a very high degree without at the expense or exclusion of others, perhaps, that this is where you get. Um, what do you make of that idea? Is part of the is the problem, as you said, kind of the woke mind virus, which is, let's call it, distinct from these core liberal ideas, or is it liberalism's really strong elevation of autonomy and subjectivity and its erosion of some of the cultural, religious, philosophical worldview that kind of held it together, buttressed it for many hundreds of years, that's at issue here?
Yeah. I think those are interesting and deep questions. Um, and it is curious how liberalism seems to have evolved um, uh, in a relatively seamless way into something very illiberal and authoritarian, without seeming to kind of pause for breath. Um, and it may be, um, as you say, that that kind of personal liberation, which was constrained by Christianity, has sort of uh, is now
Unchained.
uh, unchained. Yeah,
Yeah.
um, uh, as a result of the decline of Christianity. Um, but I think there's another way to look at it, which is that um, actually quite a lot. I mean, so the conventional way of understanding the emergence of wokeism in the last 15 years or so is that it has filled the God-shaped hole
Ah, yeah.
left by the ebbing of the Christian tide. And it does take on many of the aspects of a religion. and it's sometimes referred to as the Great Awakening. And its kind of spread seems to, in some respects, resemble kind of various kind of surges of Christian feeling that have taken place over the last 200 years or so. And it feels at times like a kind of the first new religion of the 21st century.
Yeah.
And its rapid growth has evidently been accelerated by social media.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe another one thing that kind of troubled me when I thought about that particular analysis is, well, if it's emerged as an alternative to Christianity, why is it so popular with so many Christian churches? So the Church of England, for instance, has completely embraced radical progressive ideology. I don't know if you noticed, but in the last 48 hours, I think, a lesbian vicar has been appointed an archbishop in the Church of England, and the Church of England is embarking on it's carried out an audit of the church's involvement and in the transatlantic slave trade, and has set aside £100 million to be paid to the victims or their descendants by way of reparations, even though church roofs have holes in and so forth. So maybe another way of looking at it. I mean, I've heard Peter Thiel make this analysis. Maybe not quite. Maybe don't want to attribute this view to him, but it sounded to me as though this is what he was saying. But maybe he didn't develop it in the way I'm going to develop it. But it feels more like not hyper-liberalism so much as hyper-Christianity. So various aspects of wokeism, such as the veneration of the weak and the suspicion of the strong, various aspects seem to rhyme with aspects of Christianity. And this is also an argument made by Tom Holland, the historian, that what we're seeing is not an alternative to Christianity so much as a kind of perversion of Christianity. And maybe one of the reasons that's happened, and we are living in this hyper-Christian moment, and Christianity has almost in some respects reverted to its kind of pre-Reformation condition, is that Christianity across the Western world was held in check by a reverence for the ancient world and the values associated with the ancient world, like patriotism, republican virtues.
Mm-hmm.
And as maybe what's happened since the Second World War, and particularly in the last 15 years or so, has been the decline of those republican values which we associate with the ancient world, with Rome and Greece. And those had been holding Christianity in check. There was this kind of tense relationship between the two sets of values. But the ancient republican values hadn't quite disappeared. But they've now disappeared, and Christianity is now unchained and has kind of metamorphosized into this kind of perverted version, which of course doesn't recognize itself as Christian and actually identifies often as anti-Christian, but nevertheless seems to have aspects which rhyme with some of the worst aspects of Christianity.
Right. Well, fascinating. I wasn't expecting such a lengthy response, but no, quite right. Many of these factors and strands are at play. I mean, just harkening back, because I mean, it does most closely resemble a form of Marxism, and Marx was, of course, very influenced by religious ideas. He has this kind of millenarian way of thinking, and that's how his ideas are presented. And so wokeness certainly has many of those features. I think taking all these things together, you see it's the perfect storm. There's a God-shaped hole, and there's a great emphasis placed on personal expression and subjectivity and being free for that, and also our society's rightful but now distorted elevation and protection of the vulnerable and the weak, all without the respect for and understanding of objectivity and human nature and, kind of purpose, which very much came out of the Christian and Greco-Roman worldview. So fascinating. We'll have to see where we go from here culturally on all of these issues. But I really enjoyed that answer. I won't keep you, Toby, but one final question before we go. Twofold, really. Where should the line be drawn between protected and punishable speech in, say, Canada, in the US? And then what lessons can Canadian policymakers, or British ones as well, take from your experience at the Free Speech Union?
Well, the standard I like is the standard embedded in what's called the Brandenburg test, which is a test the Supreme Court developed in adjudicating a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, in which a Klansman had described black people using various racial epithets and pejoratives, and said that it might be necessary to take revenge on the black population of his community. And he was prosecuted by the state of Ohio and defended himself by appealing to the First Amendment. And the test that emerged was that in order for speech not to be protected by the First Amendment, it had to be intended to stir up imminent lawless action, intended to bring about imminent lawless action, and likely to bring about imminent lawless action. And I think that's quite a high bar. And in fact, the court found for this Klansman, they found that his speech was protected by the First Amendment because they didn't think what he said was, even though it may have been intended to cause imminent lawless action, which kind of euphemism for violence or a breach of the peace, they didn't think it was likely to. And various people, I think, who've been prosecuted for hate speech in the UK, like Lucy Connolly. You may have heard of Lucy Connolly. She tweeted something fairly intemperate on the day that the son of an asylum seeker attacked a class of schoolgirls at a Taylor Swift dance class in Southport, a suburb of Liverpool, and killed 3 of these young girls and injured almost a dozen others. In the immediate aftermath, on the same day, she tweeted something slightly intemperate, wrongly blaming the attack on an undocumented migrant. And she deleted it within 4 hours and apologized when she realized, actually it wasn't an attack carried out by an asylum seeker, an illegal. But nevertheless, she was prosecuted for stirring up racial hatred. And she, I think, unwisely pled guilty to that and ended up getting 31 months in jail for a single tweet that she deleted within 4 hours and apologized for. That's over 2.5 years, and that's longer than some members of grooming gangs have received when pleading guilty to child sexual offences, which is pretty extraordinary and shows you how seriously the British state takes hate speech. But she, I think, could not have been prosecuted in the United States, because even had she intended to stir up racial hatred or cause imminent lawless action, I don't think what she tweeted was likely to do so. I think that should be the gold standard, which ideally should be embraced across the English-speaking world, the Brandenburg test. I mean, obviously, free speech, I don't think, protects, child pornography. It doesn't protect the betrayal of state secrets. It shouldn't protect people libeling each other. But I think within those broad limits, provided what you've said isn't intended to and isn't likely to cause a breach of the peace, then it should be permitted.
Very good. Thank you so much, Toby, for a very insightful conversation and for making the trip to Canada to help launch a chapter of the Free Speech Union here. We surely could use it. Before we go, Toby, tell us where people can find you, what you're up to next.
Yeah, well, I think people can find the Free Speech Union of Canada. I think it's fsucanada.ca, fsucanada.ca. So please check that out and please join. We found that what's really worked well, not just in the UK, but New Zealand and Australia too, is people banding together, taking collective action. It's the kind of principle underpinning the trade union movement. The way to push back is to band together. There's safety in numbers. The enemies of free speech fight in packs. They often pile on as a mob to try and get people cancelled. So we need to band together to protect free speech. And that model, creating a kind of union in which everyone pays their dues, and then if anyone gets into trouble, we can wheel out the big guns to help them. That seems to be a really effective model and is working really well in the UK and in other parts of the English-speaking world, and I hope it works equally well in Canada.
Very good. Thank you so much, Toby, for joining us. I'm Peter Copeland for Inside Policy Talks. Thanks for listening. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us share these important conversations. Take care.